We are in the season of Lent on the church calendar. If you don't have a great handle on Lent and what the purpose of it is, I would invite you to go to our website and see last Sunday's sermon. I tried to unpack clearly what the point of it was and how to observe it faithfully. It's fumcpascagoula.org. Just go to sermons. You should find it. Just look for the date. Very accessible. So we are in a Lent sermon series, and so I'm trying to, my effort, my goal is pointed at supporting us in our Lenten journey, our 40-day fast. And to do that, over the Sundays that I'm going to get to speak, I'm going to focus on the last week of Jesus' life. If you read the Gospels, it's pretty interesting at what emphasis is placed on the last week. There's very little emphasis. If you look at percentage, very little percentage placed on his birth. I know Christmas is a big time, but if you look at the ink spilled in writing about the life of Jesus, I mean, it's less than 10%. The last week of his life is close to a third of what is focused on in the Gospels. So it is a huge emphasis. And why is that? So this morning I want to focus on the Friday before Maundy Thursday. So this is like 6 days before the crucifixion goes down. And there's some time period in there that some very impactful moments happen that if you just focus on triumphal entry, Maundy Thursday, and Good Friday, you won't pick up on. And so I want to focus on them. On this particular day, there is an emphasis placed on the cross. And I know that sounds so obvious, but I'm telling you, if you do a slow read on this passages and passages similar to it, it wasn't so obvious to the disciples. It really wasn't. It took some unpacking over the years as Paul and James and Peter would reflect on it and write about it, that we would get what the real point of the cross was in regard to our walk with God. And so the central nature of the cross as it relates to our journey through these next 40 days of Lent. And I think also in this message is, like the disciples, and they're just not getting it, our resistance to it, and how that may impact our resistance, how our resistance to the message of the cross may impact what we imagine God's presence in our life should be. In other words, you may imagine at this point, if God is in my life, wouldn't I be seeing A, B, or C? And I'm just not seeing it. I mean, the preacher preaches about having levels of hope or joy or peace, and I just don't have it like I think I ought to. How the cross and our resistance to it may be impacting what we imagine God's presence in our life ought to be. And if that's the case, how our resistance to the cross may be impacting the impact that we would like to see the church having in our world. Why does it seem like the world seems to have more power than the church? May have something to do with our resistance to the cross. So that's where I'm going over the next few moments. This passage I'm going to be reading comes from the Gospel of Matthew. It begins, this is chapter 20, verse 17. It starts with, now as Jesus was going to Jerusalem. This is the beginning of his last week. Now as Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, you're always going up to Jerusalem. He's actually traveling south. We don't say, if we're in Starkville and we're going to the coast, we don't say we're going up to the coast. We say we're going down to the coast because it's south, right? Or if we're here and we're going north, then we'll say up. But that's not the culture. You always go up to Jerusalem. It's the proximity to God, so to speak. So even if you're north of Jerusalem, you're still going up. Jesus is going up to Jerusalem. And this is such an important time. There's another passage in, I believe it's Luke. Yes, it's Luke 9:51. Rather than just saying Jesus is going up to Jerusalem now, it reads something like he sets his face like a flint toward Jerusalem, like stone. If you've ever been so deliberate about something, you're like, there's nothing else I'm doing right now other than this. That is Jesus' attention to what he's doing at this point. Now, Jesus is going up to Jerusalem. He took 12 disciples aside and said to them, so he's trying to make this clear, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will turn him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified. And on the third day, he will be raised to life. This is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. Amen. Amen. Jesus' journey begins here. And if you read just a few verses later, you'll see that even though Jesus has been very, very clear about what's happening, we're going to Jerusalem. The religious leaders are going to have me crucified, handed over to Gentiles. Even though he's being very clear about this, it's as if the disciples aren't listening. The very next moment, I don't know what you would do if Jesus told you something like this, or if a friend of yours told you, look, we're going somewhere and I'm going to die. I don't know if you would respond like this, but the disciples immediately, it said, this is the very next verse, James and John have their mother, it says the mother of the sons of Zebedee, which that's the mother of James and John, send their mother to Jesus, and the mother asked Jesus, look, while you're thinking about all that, can my son sit at your right and your left when you get to heaven? I don't know if that's how your friends would talk to you. Oh, you're dying? Look, when you get to heaven, I've always liked your truck. Can I have your truck? It's kind of what they're doing. I don't know if they were texting while he was saying this, maybe they weren't listening. But this is like the third time he has said this very thing to them. There will be a time when I go to Jerusalem, I'll be handed over to the religious leaders, I'll be crucified. And it's like each time they either don't hear him, they respond in a wonky way, or even respond in a complete resistant way. Like there was one moment where Peter said, you don't have to do that. That's ridiculous. Why do that? To which Jesus had to basically rebuke him, as if Peter was acting on behalf of Satan himself. If you want to check me on that, that's Matthew chapter 16, verse 22. Point being, very resistant to the idea of Jesus being crucified. They didn't get it. Very resistant to Jesus being put to death. Okay, what they didn't understand, and what we might not understand when it comes to our resistance to crucifixion, because you'll see in a moment we're resistant to it as well. What they didn't understand was Jesus' notion of who he was as the Messiah. Now, you're going to have to take a couple minutes and just listen to me. There's a little bit of theology here. It's not really hard. Jesus mentions himself in this passage as the Son of Man. The Son of Man will be handed over to the religious leaders. This is an Old Testament phrase that is hinting of the Messiah that is to come. Now, if you don't know what the Messiah is or who the Messiah is supposed to be, I'm going to break it down for you in layman's terms. And it took me years, for some reason, to figure this out. The idea of Messiah is it's kind of a deep one, but it's essentially this. Ancient Israel went into exile. They were defeated. They lost God's protection because their heart wanted things God did not want them to have, and they continued to follow said heart. And as they did, the prophets would try and tell them, look, I don't know what you're doing, but you're going in the wrong direction. You are walking outside of God's protection. By wanting those things, you are walking outside of God's provision. And there's nothing God's going to be able to do for you if you just walk out of his provision. Kind of like a dog leaving the protection of a yard. It gets ran over. Well, stay in the yard. Anyway, so as they stepped out of God's provision, they went into exile. In 586, Babylon conquered the southern kingdom. In 722, the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom. It wasn't that God turned his back on them. It was that year after year of sending a prophet saying, hey, you're leaving my protection, and they didn't listen. They were outside of God's protection. And so what the Messiah was, by the time Jesus came around, what the Son of Man was to do, what the Messiah was to do, was to lead them out of exile. Exile meant no longer do you have, say, the United Kingdom of King David or Solomon and self-governing, self-rule. Rather, you were being ruled by a foreign power. So the Messiah was the one that was to come to deliver them from the foreign power, to give them back their right to self-rule or governing under God. That's what Messiah came to do. Their confusion of who Messiah was to be, was that the problem was not their walking outside of God's provision, their hearts wanting things God didn't want them to have. Rather, in their mind, the problem was the foreign power that dominated them and took away their self-governing or self-rule. So for Israel at the time of Jesus, what they thought the Messiah was going to do was to free them from the dominating power of the time, which was Rome. That's what they thought he was coming to do. Jesus saw his call to Messiah as very different, as seen here. I am coming here as the Son of Man. This is my role as Messiah to be crucified. It's not as if a lot of people say the Jews crucified Jesus. Well, that's ridiculous. If anyone among the Jewish community crucified Jesus, it was the Judean leaders. But truth be known, they didn't even truly crucify Jesus. Jesus would teach, no one takes my life. Okay? Don't blame this on anyone there. I lay my life down for everyone's sake. So the cross was his calling to be the Messiah, okay, to set us free from our ability to self-rule and self-govern under God, but not to relieve us from some foreign power. The crucifixion was to relieve us, as Paul would eventually unpack, as James, John, Peter would eventually unpack if you read their letters. Some years later, the cross, Jesus dying on the cross, was to relieve us from the power within. The power inside of us that wants things, that leads us outside of God's provision. The way Paul would say it is that we are called in our following of the Messiah, in our following of Jesus. The language he uses, this is Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. I just love this phrase. We are called to be crucified with Christ. To die to the side of our flesh that pulls us outside of our relationship with God and God's provision. He would say, I am crucified with Christ. He parses it out in Galatians 5:19. These are the components of our flesh that if we lean into them, if we let them be the ruling power in our life, you see? If we let these components of our flesh be the ruling power in our life, we will not be in control. They will lead us outside of God's provision and protection. The acts of the flesh, as he calls them, that we're supposed to be crucified to, that we're supposed to be dying to, as we are crucified with Christ. The acts of the flesh are obvious, he says. The first, and he mentions this, the other epistle writers mentions, this is always the first, which is very interesting. By far, it's always the first. Sexual immorality, always the first in all the lists. This is the side of us that can lead us outside of God's provision and protection. But there's plenty as far as the flesh. Sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery, idolatry. I don't think we have any witches in here. Witchcraft, but hatred. You may hate somebody. Discord. You have your relationships are in discord with someone, and you haven't been deliberate about getting the relationship clear, cleaning the air, so to speak. Jealousy is something of your flesh that you need to die to. Fits of rage. Do you ever just pop off at someone? You can't seem to control it. Later you say something like, I don't know what I was thinking. Or that wasn't me. You're very right, but you're responsible for it. You are being controlled by a power that is not a power you want to be controlled by. Fits of rage. Selfishness is something we're called to die to. Selfish ambition. Dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness. Okay, how do I know when I've had too much to drink? When someone starts asking, "Hey, have you had enough?" I mean, that's pretty much it. Orgies. Glad we're not worried about that, and the like. I warn you. Several of the other writers of the epistles have their lists, but there's plenty of categories that land right in your lap. Some of them you might be like, well, I'm certainly not wrestling with that. But some of them land right in our laps. And the truth is, we are called to put these things to death. We are called to follow Jesus in the way of the cross. The cross is not just about Jesus bridging the gap between heaven and earth, and all of a sudden we have access to heaven. It is about that, but it is also a way we are called to follow. Jesus would even teach, unless you pick up your cross and follow me, you have no part with me. We have a cross to carry. And our cross, as Paul and the subsequent disciples unpacked it, was we are to die to the flesh that was the very problem that had Israel ultimately exiled by a foreign power. There is an old Native American wisdom that I've always thought relates very well to this. There was a Cherokee grandfather speaking to his grandson, and he said to his grandson, just after a war, the grandson was very impressed or excited by the war they had been in, and seeing how excited he was over all that went on during war, he said to his grandson, "There is a war," and he put his hand on him, and he said, "inside of me." The grandfather is talking about himself. And he says to him, there is a war between two wolves, a dark wolf and a light wolf. The dark wolf animates me through anger and envy and jealousy and sorrow and regret and greed and arrogance and self-pity and resentment and inferiority and in lies and in false pride and in feelings of superiority and in ego getting the best of me. There is a dark wolf warring in me against the wolf of light, and the wolf of light animates me with joy and peace and love and hope and serenity and humility and kindness and benevolence and empathy and generosity and truth and compassion and faith. And he just kept listing these things that, the grandson was like, well, I know which wolf I want animating me. And the grandfather says, and the same war is going on inside of you and everyone we know. And the grandson asked, well, which wolf is going to win that war? To which the grandfather says something like, the one you feed, the one you lean into. And the opposite can be true. If the grandson had said, well, which one is going to lose the war? The cross would say something like the one you starve, the one you defeat. So the truth is we all have this tension inside of us of there being this flesh that leads us in a way that is not towards God. And the more we follow the crucified Jesus through this Lent season of allowing, this is what fasting is all about. Okay, you have an appetite of the flesh that you are denying. It's as if you're sort of practicing for crucifying your flesh. You're getting familiar with it. And the more you do it, what the early church thought was, the more we engage in this fast, the more we engage in this crucifying of self, the more we are preparing our hearts to truly receive Easter, the resurrection. The message of the resurrection is receiving God anew, or actually coming out of exile because of the Messiah, right? Not being governed or ruled by some power we don't want, which is inside of us truly, rather having the freedom to walk in love in subjugation to God. The more we crucify the flesh, if you can grab onto that, the more you follow Jesus and carrying the cross by that, the more you'll find yourself doing less of the things that are dark, like complaining. And the more you'll find yourself sort of doing resurrected things like gratitude. The more you crucify the flesh, the less you'll find yourself being so pessimistic about what's going on in the world around you, in your life. And the more you'll lean into a heart of hope with the audacity to think you actually have a preferred future ahead of you. It makes a difference. The more you crucify the flesh, the more you'll find yourself doing less of harshly judging people around you. Like something happens and you're always looking for the negative. Always finding the negative. Even if it's just the littlest thing. The life of your children, the life of your children's children, or you're a child, the life of your parent, the life of your pastor, the life of anyone. You're looking for the negative. You die to the flesh, and all of a sudden, you're interpreting people with generosity. And you're seeing the good that they bring to the situation. It's the difference between the dark wolf and the light wolf. It's the difference between flesh, living to the flesh, and being resurrected with Christ. The more you crucify the flesh, so to speak, the less you'll deal with anger, the more you'll be patient with people. The less you'll be petty about things, the more you'll be mature about things. The less you'll be animated by jealousy, and the more you'll be content. You don't care how much someone has, and you don't. Whatever, that's yours. Great. I'm glad God's doing that with you. Wonderful. I celebrate you. I celebrate your accomplishments because you're totally content with who you are and what you have because you have crucified the flesh. The flesh is the thing that puts you at odds with other people. If you find yourself at odds with the world around you, it's not so much because the world around you is the freest I've ever felt is when I finally figured out that the problem. See, I used to think the problem was you. It was you. It was you right there specifically. Come up here. No, I'm just kidding. No, it was all of you. It was the world around me. That was the problem. But nothing happened. Nothing got better that way. When I started looking inside and finding the problem right here is and I'm not saying I do it great. There are so many parts of me that I still need to crucify. I don't always pick up my cross, but I know I experience more of the resurrected life the more I do this. The less gloomy I am about things, and the more I'm seeing, not just seeing the beauty around me, because there is beauty around me. There is beauty around you. But if you're being led around by the flesh, You're going to be a gloomy individual. You're going to be seeing the cloud all the time. The more I crucify the flesh, the more I not only see the beauty, the more I enjoy the beauty. One of the biggest failures in life is to be very successful at life, but you don't enjoy it. And there's a lot of people living like that. The less I am inclined to gossip, the more I'm inclined to just build people up. Rather than jumping in conversations where someone's being talked about negatively, I'm either, I'm not even talking. I don't want to. But rather, the more I'm building people up in my conversation, the less I'm giving up. And when I mean giving up, I mean just, forget it. And the more I'm hanging in there. It's a life worth living, crucifying the flesh. Life's walk is long, and it is less about how far you walk, but how we are moved in our hearts as we walk. Hear this. If I walk far, but I'm angry on my journey, then I've walked far in the wrong direction. If I conquer mountains, you may think it's all about conquering mountains, and so forget crucifying the flesh. I'm after accomplishing something. If I conquer mountains, but I hold grudges and bitterness as I conquer, then what I've defeated, what I've conquered, is my own joy. Not worth it. If I see much, I want to see as much as I can of this world. Forget crucifying my flesh. I want to see everything I can. If I see much, but I regard others as threats or enemies, then I don't see my share of peace. Whatever you carry, Jesus is saying, that invites a backward walking, leave it behind. Crucify the flesh. So, ask yourself one of these questions as we go into communion. Do you consider the cross as a part of your following of Jesus? By the way, I don't know if I mentioned we're doing communion. We usually do communion the first Sunday of the month, but I'm not going to be with y'all the first Sunday of the month, so I thought we'd go ahead and do it. Do you consider the cross as a part of your following of Jesus? Not just what Jesus did for you. Like only Jesus does that. It's something Jesus wants to do in you, which is why he said, "Follow me in this." Do you consider that as a part of your following? Or two, this is really the thing. What part of you needs to be crucified? That's one of the best conversations you can ever have with yourself. What part of your flesh do you need to die to? It may not happen immediately. I mean, we're not Jesus. But the moment you agree with God about it is the moment you start taking steps in that direction. And finally, here's another way to help you in that, once you identify it. Have you ever shared that struggle? In other words, the thing you know God's calling you to crucify within yourself, your flesh. Have you ever shared that struggle with a trusted sister or brother? I'm struggling with, if you've never identified what it is you need to die to, you're going to have a lot of issues that are not drawing you towards God into the life that you imagined you would have with God. But once you start identifying it and dying to it, the way to increase the chances of making progress is to share that with someone. Jesus was sharing his path to the cross over and over and over. And subsequently in their letters, they would share with one another their path to the cross. They would write to their churches about their responsibility in their path to the cross and how they should encourage one another, build one another up in doing that. Have you ever, this could be a spiritual breakthrough for you. Have you ever identified the place in you that needs to be crucified? And moreover, have you ever shared that with like a spiritual buddy, a spiritual partner. Talk about your failures with it. Talk about your victories with it. Hey, I'm winning over this. Hey, I need prayer over this.